Recording in progress.
All right, good evening. Today is Tuesday, December 19th. I'd like to call our work session to order with roll call present in the boardroom. We have members Donnelly, Jacobs, Lessons, Wilson, Holloman, and Bellamy. And we will update the roster as we continue. We also have Dr. Bryant, several staff, as well as our executive assistant, Miss Amanda Foster. So with that, I'd like to go to item B. Any board requests for information that have not been filled? Does anyone have any requests? Member Donnelly.
Madam President, I'd really like us at the beginning of our regular meeting to establish the Robert's Rules of Order rule that we were debating 2 meetings ago that we think has been resolved, but I think it'd be really important to get it on the record that it is appropriate to discuss the main motion and then following a discussion of that by an individual member to be able to move an amendment. I really think it's important to get that on the record to establish that for future board meetings.
Thank you, Member Donnelly. Any other, that's not a request but for the information, but it's a request for future action. Thank you. So not seeing any requests for board requests for information, we are going to move to our discussion topic for today, which is the budget guidance. That guidance is attached, of course, to the agenda. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bryant so that we can have opportunities for discussion and questions.
All right. Thank you, Madam President. So in a minute, I'll kick it off to our Chief Financial Officer, Andy Ratliff, but I do want to make a couple of statements just for the general public who may be watching to really understand where we're at when it comes to the budget development process and what is this document that we'll be discussing today. So a couple of things. So one, today we'll be reviewing what we call budgetary guidance. So this is a draft that the board will review which essentially captures information that we've gathered from our Saturday work session and other opportunities for input. ASD does have a statutory deadline to pass a balanced budget that we'll submit to the Assembly for additional approvals. And our budget does need to be balanced based on our confirmed revenues and expenditures. And that's really important because, as we all know, the governor's budget did not include any increases to education funding. And while the legislature may come together to provide an increase like they came together to vote for an increase last legislative session, we won't know that information for quite some time. So with that said, with the feedback of the community through a preliminary survey, through feedback gathered from the board, through our Saturday activity, we've come to this document that we'll review today. And just a couple of things that I want to stress. By and large, what we attempted to do was to incorporate feedback that was shared from numerous board members. So, for example, what you'll see in the document is, for example, PTR, the pupil to teacher ratio for K3, was held harmless in this one scenario that we're considering. And that's specifically because we heard from multiple board members that we need to determine a way to work towards our board goals, even though we're in this dire financial situation. We also heard directly from the public and from board members that we want to protect and minimize the impact directly to the classroom. And for that reason, in this scenario that we'll go into in greater depth in just a couple of minutes, we've proposed an unprecedented step of spending down our fund balance down to 5%. So for scale, for the public to understand, the budget deficit that we're looking at is approaching around $98 million, and spending down fund balance to 5% is about $71 million. So really the bulk of what we're proposing to go towards the deficit would be fund balance, which would not directly impact the classroom, though that does come with its own set of considerations for the board to think about. And while this document does describe a pupil to teacher ratio adjustment for grades 4 through 12, the series of other reductions that we'll talk through are intentionally there to minimize additional impact to the pupil to teacher ratio. So really, we looked at all of our options and we're trying to provide relief from proposing a greater PTR increase than would be necessary. So that's how we came to this initial document. It's an initial point of discussion, and this is not the last time that we'll talk about it. And the reason why we're starting this off in a work session format is because we want feedback. We do want to improve, and we do want to capture notes that maybe we didn't capture from Saturday that we want to include in the document moving forward. But it's going to be a long path that's not going to be without pain when it comes to getting towards a balanced budget by the end of February. So with that said, I'd like to hand it off to Andy Ratliff to go through the details of this initial scenario.
Thank you, Dr. Bryant. So the memo that as we've written it, we had some items that seemed to have some fairly clear consensus when we did the Saturday work session. Those are the items that are listed. If Amanda would scroll down a little bit, there's the first section of bullet points on there have just some things that most of the school board members had indicated they didn't want to see reduced. K3 PTR, middle school model. And really the other ones are ones we didn't really get clear consensus on whether the board would be willing or not to entertain reductions to these things. And for some of the items, we left amounts purposely off of them because they may adjust depending on what gets pulled off the table at this point. But really our goal with this memo is to get a little more firm guidance from the board. And then as we're looking at this, you can make amendments to it to move things from the bottom section to the top or the top to the bottom once we think we have a better understanding of our consensus. I would say the last 3 bullet points on the things we could possibly reduce at the bottom are new that we didn't have in the Saturday work session. And those would be increasing activity fees, increasing rental fees for folks using district facilities, and then possibly delaying some curriculum purchases. We have a wedge of funds to update just various curriculums throughout the district to see which of those we could pull out and potentially delay a year or so. But that really, this is just kind of an opportunity for the board to discuss what their priorities are and kind of help come to a consensus of if there's things that the board's not willing to support reducing, if we can kind of get those out of the way now so we know as we're going into budget development in January.
All right, thank you. So, board members, this is your opportunity to ask questions or to share information. This is not the time, though, to make amendments, but because we're not in business, right? We're not in a business session. But this item is on our non-action agenda for tonight, which is why it's so timely that we have this discussion. So I think it's appropriate that we hear from each board member. So who wants to go first? I know this is a tough one. They're all tough. Member Jacobs.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. One of the items that we spoke to as a group during our Saturday work session was the consideration of utilizing part of the fund balance should we draw down to 5% to address our goals. With the current trajectory of budget development, where would summer school and kind of the current programming that we've experienced the last couple of years that has demonstrated pretty significant growth for students land? Would we be able to support a similar level of programming? Because I think there's a desire, if possible, to pair reductions with potentially targeted investment. If we can dovetail that with things that we know work for our students, that may be a path that I would imagine a majority of the board would support. So hopefully looking for information to that end.
Sure. Thank you, Member Jacobs. So I'll kick us off. So one of the things that we captured from the Saturday work session that's at the very top of the second page would be credit recovery, and that it specifically addresses what the board members expressed, that we want to protect things that the data shows can provide a positive impact on student achievement. With that said, you do see that summer school is on the list of potential reductions. So I would like to ask Mr. Gustafson to add some light to what that means.
So as far as summer school goes, the last budget cycle that we did for this, so which is this upcoming June, we have already cut summer school by half. So we have half the amount of money for this upcoming June summer school than we did a year ago because of the budget that we're working on right now. The things that we're looking at for summer school reductions for this summer would go into this budget would be more of the first time attempts in virtual. Right now, students can take 2 classes during the summer to try to bump up their credits and get ahead. And what this proposal would be looking at decreasing that so where they would only be able to probably take 1 of those courses during the summer. So the actual elementary piece that we were talking about, we are going to have to look at some modeling for that just because of the budget that was passed last year. But on top of that, we're also looking at a different model for middle school. So we're kind of looking at the overall whole, but the pieces that are showing the great increases, we want to try to keep those as much as possible. Just that first attempts are the ones that we're looking at cutting for summer school.
Madam President, can I follow up?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And through the superintendent to Mr. Gustafson or the team, how does that information intersect with the increased spend that we'll have to allocate to comply with the Alaska Reads Act?
We're still looking at that and seeing exactly how that's going to be, because our model that we've been working off of with summer school was the month of June, or so 19 days. With Juneteenth, that makes it about 18 days this year, which is about double what is required from the Alaska Reads Act. So we're looking at having different sessions maybe for those kids that are having to do some of that remedial work, but then still having the robust program for
many of our kids.
Thank you, Madam President. Could I just close out my turn the rotation here with some comments? I think I fairly closely align with the items in the memorandum, although I would lean towards grouping summer school in with credit recovery. I mean, just because we have data that shows how impactful that is, and it's closely aligned with the READS Act, which is where our legislature has indicated that we should be spending resources. I do support strong consideration of dropping down the fund balance to 5%. I think that takes less complication out of our advocacy in Juneau, as there's a fair amount of misunderstanding as to how school district fund balance works, why it's spent over the course of a school year. And so allocating that, given the scope of our deficit, seems generally appropriate. We've talked last year about pupil to teacher ratio being one of the more flexible items. The legislature has 3 potential off-ramps to address school funding as I see it this year. The first, of course, is a veto override, which can occur as soon as session starts in January. They then have a supplemental budget, which can occur in the first 60 to 90 days, I think. And that additional funds could be allocated there to address immediate need. And then, of course, there's the passage of a bill which permanently allocates a BSA increase, and then the operating budget, which would fund that BSA increase. And so there's ample opportunity for legislators who have repeatedly expressed a desire to increase the base student allocation to do so, which I think lends itself to us making decisions that, to a reasonable extent, are flexible in nature to reverse. And those that aren't, I think we need to have a pretty clear priority plan laid out for what additional funding may look like should additional priorities have to be cut. Regarding district administration, I am certainly open to exploring. I do want to make sure that we're careful not to reduce functions that affect our district's operation to support students and specifically bring in additional revenues. I'd heard informally that at one point we, under a prior board, cut staff that billed Medicaid for additional funds that could be received and spent to support student services. And so that reduction in turn was a net negative for us. So we need to do so smartly, and flat across the board cuts are, in my opinion, irresponsible and demonstrating a lack of leadership, which we simply can't afford at the local level. I think the other items on here in terms of the dome device purchases, these are reasonable. Travel, I think, is a reasonable reduction given the advent of Zoom during the pandemic. The item I would ask is if the board does draw consensus to reduce the district-wide travel budget, I think the board should do the same with our budget. It is a fraction of what the district travel-wide budget is. However, for us to have a different standard, I think would be inappropriate. And it wouldn't take effect anyway until July 1. So I would like to see those two match. Those are my thoughts for now. Interested to hear other board members' perspectives. Appreciate it. Thank you, Madam President.
Sure. Thank you. All right, Member Lessons.
Thank you for the opportunity. Member Jacobs, thank you for being brave enough to open this challenging conversation. One of the things that I was thinking about as an approach is we have multi-tiered systems of support in the district, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And maybe I'm just saying the same thing in a different way than Member Jacobs earlier. I'd like us to prioritize things in this budget process that, one, could be immediately walked back in the event of in the event of a veto override. Number 2, I'd like us to identify which set of cuts could be reversed if the base student allocation is adjusted for inflation. And number 3, would be things that we could reverse if we received an adequate level of funding, which would align with the evidence-based model. And so however that looks in the budget sort of document or budget proposal in February, I think that flagging what could be walked back most easily. And in the same vein, well, maybe it's not the entirely same vein. One of the things that I found that I disagreed with on Memo 087, and maybe that's because I wasn't listening to other board members' conversations, I don't understand how we can, in light of the Moore case, allocate funds towards sports and activities at this point in time when we don't have a clear path forward for investing in board goals for reading and math. I would, and I say that as a former high school student athlete and somebody who believes wholeheartedly in supporting the whole child. But the reality is that we have a $98 million deficit that hasn't been adjusted in our students' lifetimes. The lifetime of a 7 or an 8 or a 9-year-old, that picture hasn't changed since they were born. I was talking with high school students at the student advisory board. They were toddlers when the Moore decision was issued. And I think it's imperative that we align every penny we have with instruction. And that means that we have to prioritize our board goals. So I would ask other board members to consider the weight of that terrible decision to eliminate sports and activities. However, that would be one of those items that we could walk back, maybe in the event of a base student allocation inflation adjustment. I would walk back PTR increases with a veto override first, and then round that out with a base student allocation increase. I'm also uncomfortable leaving the number of holdback positions on the table. I think that's a really important piece in the administration's toolkit to adjust. We have a 30% rate of transiency in our district. And I think it's imperative that we are nimble enough to address that. I think that we've seen class sizes unexpectedly blossom, grow at certain schools. I think that's a really important tool that we shouldn't get rid of. I'm uncomfortable delaying on curriculum purchases. I think that some of our curricular purchases are absolutely imperative. You know, I don't know if the CKLA for grades 4 and 5 is one of those things, but okay. But there are certainly other areas where we want our students to have up-to-date information. And I think that's really important. I'm also, there was an amazing story in the paper today about a school nurse who recognized that although we don't have, although schools offer vision screening through our Lions Club partners, the nurse was boots on the ground and noticed that families were not following through. She could look at the rates of average eyeglass use, and she looked at her students' rate of eyeglass use, and she looped in a local community partner. And because we had that school nurse doing her job at that school, we have kids who are getting the vision treatment they need so that they can see the screens and see the classroom spaces they're working in. It's imperative, I think, that we have school nurses and our librarians at all of our schools. So I would ask board members to consider removing that from, I'm not sure what the word, from budget reductions. I would also ask, I think programs are a very challenging thing to resurrect once they've gone away. Because as we've shared, as you've shared, Dr. Bryant, the last time a number of positions were slated to be eliminated, you know, a third of those people left the state. Programs, I think, are less elastic than a PTR number when we can still hope for a veto override. So to that end, I would ask that we consider removing Ignite, the immersion classes, the immersion class size reduction from the budget reduction group. And then really to wrap up where I began, I appreciate hearing from Member Jacobs that he would be willing to spend the district fund balance down to 5%. Again, that's something that takes a supermajority of the board. I would also support that activity. And then I would ask the board, and I brought this up at our board retreat, or not a retreat, or at our work session. I would ask the board to consider investing 1.5% of that, which is $9 million, to support growth in reading. And I would ask the board to consider investing another 0.5%, which would be $3 million in support of middle school math. And there's much more I could say about that, but I have that spelled out, and maybe this is not the time for that. So targeted investments in reading and math with the fund balance that we have. And I think one of the things that occurred to me, and I don't have the data, but my suspicion is that the vacancies and attrition that we are experiencing in ASD may be disproportionately taking place at some locations and not sort of even across the district. And what I think I understand is that schools that have, whose students face more headwinds at our title schools, at our schools serving greater concentrations of socioeconomically disadvantaged students, may be experiencing higher rates of turnover. And so these would be targeted allocations of fund balance that has been generated through attrition and vacancy. And it would be a direct reinvestment back in many of those schools in the students who need the most growth. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Member Lesowitz. Who'd like to go next? Let the record show that Member Higgins joined us at 4:20. Who'd like to go next? So while the others were thinking, I'll chime my 2 cents in. I agree with targeting our struggling students. I do systemically. But I struggle with if we're still gonna have to cut, the money has to come from somewhere. So I guess I just need to hear from the administration. I mean, we're cutting $98 million, and then we're going to target a portion of that in a different way. To me, unless my math is just bad, we're still short. We got to cut deeper, is what I'm saying. Is that correct? Am I thinking correctly?
That's accurate, Madam President. So if we were to allocate $8 million from fund balance towards students, there's a value add there that we can deliberate. But that does mean that we need to identify $8 million from one of the categories either here or one that we didn't list.
Okay. And then my other question has to do, okay, you already answered that one, because the curriculum purchase does not include our ELA curriculum.
That's correct, Madam President. That's been purchased.
Okay,
So CKLA 4.5 is purchased.
Okay. So a year delay would not be harmful there. So some of the items on this list have a really, I mean, we have an amount posted, and I know we have another list somewhere where we have where we have an amount for each item that's that's in the memo. When it comes to, I'm a little nervous about the fund balance, although I think I support the 5%. And I know we don't have crystal balls, but do we have a sense of, is there a figure or an amount that we annually have to rely on our fund for? I mean, is $6 million a reasonable? I know it's low to me. Can somebody help me understand that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so that gives you, if we bring it down to 5%, that gives you about $6 million of just real flexibility. There are other categories of encumbrances, such as encumbrances, reserves for federal impact aid, things you could dip into in the case of a real emergency. However, you'd have to have a plan to put those back. So we would maintain sufficient cash flow for operations But, if you have an earthquake or something, like in 2018, when the board was immediately able to allocate $30 million to help get those repairs started. You may not have that same level of flexibility as you do now.
Okay. All right. Okay, so the items that for me, as I sit here off the table, my non-negotiables are the summer school with credit recovery, and these are the ones I shared at the work session. Nurses, I mean, I know that we have schools of 500 or 300 that have a nurse, but then we also have larger complexes that have a nurse, one nurse. And so short of cutting them, I think we need to try to find a way to increase. I think right now we have a nurse at each school, or do some schools still have part-time nurses?
We have one, well, I guess it depends on if they're fully staffed, but we have a nurse